All right, we got another interesting business here in a sector that I've really started to come to like quite a bit, just given number of big things. One of the biggest being margins are usually insane. They can be run as one or two man teams into the eight-figure in revenue marker, and into the almost million in EBITDA marker. And oftentimes, the multiples aren't too crazy in this type of space. And so, byproduct of all that, they can also be run remotely very oftentimes. So, all of that pulled together really makes me like these types of industries. And so, what I'm talking about is staffing companies. Now, my preference is always towards healthcare because healthcare being recession resistant and so on. Now, they do obviously, as a result of that, have a slightly higher multiple than most of the others that you see. But in general, I've found with all of them, they can kind of sustain those big elements. So they can be run remotely. They have small teams. They have crazy margins. Um, and with some right automation and some good systems, you can run them as a one man company into 500, 600, 700,000 in EBITDA. It's pretty wild. So this one here is a staffing company, franchise staffing company based in North Carolina. $993,000 asking on 455 cash flow. Obviously has to be reviewed, and likely what's happening is they're adding back the owner salary here, so it's probably more like 350, 300,000 in EBITDA, to be determined, obviously. But the reason for the multiple here being so low is because it's a franchise, pretty much. But that said, I haven't seen many staffing companies go from more than three and a half, maybe four times as well. Gross revenue 8 million. Big piece of this is because oftentimes with some of these staffing companies, the payroll of the person being placed is sometimes part of the company. And so it's kind of almost a wash in margin there. So they can do crazy big numbers, but their net profit doesn't look as high because they're basically washing out salary. They're getting paid small margin in between, and they take their cut. And oftentimes they also get paid on placement, things like that. That's really where they make their money. So very interesting, but it's a 5-year-old company. It's franchise based with a big franchise. That's always good. That means banks are usually quite willing to finance those. Owners looking to retire, again, always a good scenario. And they do specify, so owner's discretionary income from 2023 is this cash flow. So this does include the owner's salary. So when you replace out an operator, say at a 100 grand or 80 grand a year, we've seen some where it's entirely operated by a 70 grand a year person, and then the rest is pure net cash. But assuming you place with a decent salary, long term benefits, all that, call it about 125K gets pulled out of here. You're still netting out 320, through was it 330 after all is said and done in EBITDA. So not too bad at all for the asking being basically three times. Now that said, lease facility, they have a territory, which is the only kind of pain with these types of businesses. It is hard to adapt to territory, but they do have one. But I mean, pretty decent size, all things considered, that it's a franchise, and they will have access to a bunch of things as a result of that. So you may have access to certain bank loans that make this more on terms than the SBA even, but you'll have access to a whole suite of SOPs and processes to make the transition very smooth. And with all that said, 7 employees run this. So kind of interesting for this type of company. Often what we're seeing with this type of company is a bunch of commission-based recruiters and usually like one administrative staff and an owner, even into the 6 or 700,000 in net profit range. So it'll definitely need to be investigated just what these folks are making up, whether these are recruiters that are being paid a base, or maybe they're administrative folks, or maybe they're just operational folks. You never quite know. But cool thing here, third party financing available. So they are looking at this as someone who's going to come in and bank finance it. You will notice in staffing, in the medical space, that there's oftentimes a note here saying no SBA. And sometimes even in staffing companies we're coming across, they say no SBA. And that's just because sometimes it can be a complex process or it just takes too long for them or otherwise. And staffing companies have those margins where they can ask for things like that other people usually can't. But because this is a franchise, they're okay with that. So when you look at the numbers here, $8 million in revenue, 455 in cash flow listed. We'll actually, let's adjust this, right? So let's actually adjust this to what we just calculated there. We basically remove out about $125,000 a year for an operator, so call it 100 grand plus 20 grand a year or 25 grand a year in payroll taxes. So 330. They're only really asking 3 times. So very, very solid. Of the 455, they're only asking 2 times. When you include all your fees and working capital, I'm just going to assume 150. It might be much more, it might be much less. You're not quite sure. But franchise model driven, it's probably 150 to 200 is the realistic working capital. You're basically ending up with $1 million SBA loan on 80% and 198 seller finance. And there's potential that you might actually be able to get 100% finance through a franchise specific loan. You never know. But let's assume SBA structure. So 80-20. And typical SBA terms, 11.25%. We're seeing some come down to the 11% marker in anticipation of some of the things that are going on with rate cuts. But let's assume current what we're seeing in a lot of our term sheets. 11.25%, 10-year amortization, meaning you're financing 1.044 million, and the rest is delayed out over 2 years plus. Your debt service ratio is great, 1.8 times, meaning you're paying 174, you're netting 155 after replacing an operator at a very generous salary. Or what you can do even better is take this down to more like 90 and give that person a little bit of equity, right? Basically 80 grand, 85 grand a year plus a nice 5 or 10% equity stake. And in which case you are netting $190,000 a year after all is said and done. And then obviously you pay your taxes and you can basically pay yourself a good, 120 grand a year, 150 grand a year salary to kind of just sit on top and do not too much. Which, I mean, that said, it's a franchise that will expect you to be a owner that is hands-on. That doesn't necessarily mean you need to actually do anything. You just need to operate it well. So very, very interesting business. If you're in the Facebook group, by all means, ask us questions down below. We've started to become kind of an expert at staffing as a byproduct of some of our partners that are keenly in it. I'll say expert, but we've looked at a lot of these deals. So if you have questions in the Facebook group, drop them down below. If you're on YouTube, go ahead and find how to join the Facebook group and join us in there because we have a lot more exclusive stuff in there. But also, by all means, drop any questions you have in the comments and we're happy to answer them.